In the history of filmmaking, female directors have often been overshadowed by their male compatriots when it comes to awards season in Hollywood, despite receiving acclaim for their work from critics. Female directors have been responsible for some truly memorable and powerful pieces of cinema over the last 50 years. It's a simple statement of fact. Look at Jane Campion's The Piano, Nikki Caro's Whale Rider, Sofia Coppola's The Virgin Suicides, Ava DuVernay's Selma, Greta Gerwig's Little Women, Patty Jenkins' Monster, and Chloe Zhao's Nomadland, to name but a few. Many are on the critics' end-of-year best movie list, but when it comes to Hollywood's big night, until recent years, their talents have gone unrecognized. But one director finally broke the mold in 2010, becoming the first woman to win Best Director at the Oscars for The Hurt Locker, and that was Kathryn Bigelow.
No one makes their own way, least of all a woman. You'll need to marry well.
But you are not married, aren't you?
Well, that's because I'm rich.
Here at FilmFellas, we thought we would celebrate Kathryn Bigelow's achievement, but also showcase that she is more than just an Oscar winner by celebrating her enviable career and a stable of fantastic and thought-provoking films.
Does either one of you have anything even remotely interesting to tell me?
Caught my first tube this morning, sir.
So put the surfboard away, sit back, and let the FilmFellas blow you away with the brilliance that is Kathryn Bigelow. Born in San Carlos, California in 1951, Bigelow followed an education in the arts, which involved studying at the San Francisco Art Institute, where she received a BA in Fine Arts. The route to becoming a film director for Bigelow was indeed a strange one. She lived for a time in New York as an impoverished artist, where her flatmate was future Diving Bell and the Butterfly director, Julian Schnabel. And she even went into business with legendary musician Philip Glass, renovating rundown apartments for healthy profits. From there, she enrolled in the graduate film program at Columbia University and co-directed her first film, The Setup, which was a 20-minute short deconstruction of violence in film, which won favor with legendary movie director Milos Forman. Yes, he of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and Amadeus fame. Interestingly, when making the film, Bigelow actively encouraged her actors to physically beat and bludgeon each other throughout the film's all-night shoot.
Come on, hit me before I lose my nerve.
This experience led to Bigelow teaming up with fellow director Monty Montgomery to direct 1981's The Loveless, a film also notable for featuring William Dafoe in his first starring role, clad in leather as a biker, the scene-stealing bad guy of the movie.
What's the problem?
The Loveless is about a rebellious biker gang and their escapist antics that showcase their existential despair.
We're going nowhere. Fast.
Each of these bikers is dealing with traumas of their past, while also grappling with their slings and arrows of southern townfolk. For a very intimate story on people's lives, the film has a very detached filmmaking style, with very few close-ups. Wide shots are used to emphasize the detachment characters like Vance feel from the larger world, their isolation. Even in tighter pieces of framing, the characters are always kept at a distance from the camera. Visually, The Loveless is a much slower-paced creation than a typical Bigelow effort, which matches the hangout vibe of the script. Despite its mixed reviews at the time, the film is generally loved by critics, as highlighted in this contemporary review by the movie elite. Pretty close to plotless, but with enough style and cool to offset the simplicity of the script, The Loveless is a striking gut punch that sticks to the ribs. Writer-directors Kathryn Bigelow and Monty Montgomery collaborated on this neat little film that oozes an ingrained, era-perfect snapshot of a time and place that almost feels dreamlike. It would take 5 years for Bigelow to realize her next feature, the vampire classic Near Dark, released in 1987. Interestingly, Bigelow never set out to make a vampire movie. She had wanted to make a Western, but found funding for a Western hard to come by, as by this point, Westerns had fallen out of favor. Bigelow had always had an interest in the revisionist interpretation of cinema, which led her and co-writer Eric Red to combine two genres, the vampire movie and the Western.
Man's got to do something for a living these days.
Dying ain't much of a living, boy.
This helped them find funding as Fright Night had recently become a box office hit, and the vampire genre was having a bit of a revival, which arguably would peak with The Lost Boys, released the same summer as Near Dark. Despite Near Dark now being seen as a classic of the vampire genre, it bombed at the box office at the time, only recouping $3.4 million of its $5 million budget. An LA Times review at the time going some way to explaining why audiences stayed away from the movie and seemed to opt for the pop culture behemoth that was The Lost Boys. Near Dark is probably too violent for any but hardcore horror audiences, but unlike The Hitcher, it isn't illogically violent or artificially horrific. Bigelow's visual style, rudimentary in her earlier film, The Loveless, is often sensational here. She's made a film whose pop nihilism and occasional wild beauty can raise a few honest shivers.
It's just something that you do night after night. It's only ever a question of time.
Modern reviews will look on the film more favourably, however. A 2018 review commenting that, overall, Near Dark is a clever movie. Bigelow's knack for creating stylish characters doesn't falter. And with her direction, the Western-style shots complement the deadly vampire narrative. Near Dark sets us up for Bigelow's future achievements, cementing this film as an ageless cult classic. Regardless of its box office, Near Dark would give Bigelow her first taste of awards, winning Best Director at the Saturn Awards and recognition in both Paris and Brussels film festivals.
It's finger licking good.
Post Near Dark, Bigelow turned her talents to creating a music video for New Order's Touched by the Hand of God, and would start writing her next feature with Near Dark co-writer Eric Red. This would become the Jamie Lee Curtis star vehicle, the controversial 1990 release Blue Steel. In 1989, Bigelow would marry legendary producer and director James Cameron, who would begin executive producing a thriller that was earmarked for Ridley Scott. When Scott fell through, Cameron suggested Bigelow for the director's chair, and filming began on the thriller Johnny Utah, which would then be called Riders on the Storm. Then, halfway through filming, finally being renamed Point Break.
Rock and roll!
A film that would become a box office smash, despite going head-to-head with Cameron's own sci-fi smash hit sequel, Terminator 2: Judgment Day. One of the interesting things about Point Break, especially considering that Ridley Scott was originally asked to direct the film, is actually how much it looks and feels like a Tony Scott film, which could just be a stylistic theme of action movies of the time, and, as covered by FilmFellas in episode 3, arguably the greatest purveyor of actioners at 80s and 90s was the North Shield's legend himself. Regardless, it is an indication of Bigelow's talent and versatility that the comparison is even possible. Face it, in that era, she wouldn't have even been offered the job if she couldn't cut it. While some heist movies are clinically, almost pornographically interested in the mechanics of committing a crime, just watch any of the Ocean's 11 films, Point Break is more concerned about the relationship between the two main leads. The constant juxtapositions between them, from the simplistic villain and cop to the complicated guru and follower relationship that Patrick Swayze's very charismatic and controlling Bodhi nurtures with all his surfing, spiritual, armed robber acolytes. When Point Break was released, critics were quick to dismiss it as just another action movie, but in Bigelow's hands, a potentially conventional story became a subversive, anti-establishment film about being seduced, blackmailed, and radicalized by your idol, and this was picked up at the time by Roger Ebert's 4.5-star review. Bigelow is an interesting director for this material. She's interested in the ways her characters live dangerously for philosophical reasons. They aren't men of action, but men of thought who choose action as a way of expressing their beliefs. That adds an intriguing element to their characters and makes the final confrontation in this movie as meaningful as it can be, given the admittedly preposterous nature of the material. There's a foot chase through the streets, yards, alleys and living rooms of Santa Monica, 2 skydiving sequences with virtuoso photography, powerful chemistry between the good and evil characters, and an ominous, brooding score by Mark Isham that underlines the mood. The plot of Point Break, summarized, invites parody. Rookie agent goes undercover as surfer to catch bank robbers. The result is surprisingly effective. Bigelow and Cameron's working relationship would continue, even if their marital one ended. He would go on to co-write and produce Bigelow's next feature, the underrated and underappreciated sci-fi movie Strange Days. starring Ralph Fiennes. It's a film that imagines a dystopian LA where virtual reality and racial injustice discomfortingly cross paths. Those who love the film really love it, but for a movie that cost $42 million and only made $8 million back, it is easy to see why many dismiss it, and Bigelow would spend several years directing TV episodes of Homicide: Life on the Street before being given a crack at another feature, 2000's The Weight of Water, which, despite a lukewarm reception from the critics, would make $321 million off just a $16 million budget. But back to Strange Days, because, we have to admit, at FilmFellas we love this movie. It's not a perfect film by any means, but is a movie that stands as a solid variation of those films about technology, more specifically one's reactions and fears to it or of it. In this instance, virtual reality. In that respect, it sits alongside films such as Ex Machina, that cast the spotlight onto how technology and its misuse or abuse could have disturbing side effects. Anyway, track it down, check it out, and tell us what you think in the comments section. It can't be all bad, as it won Bigelow Best Director at the Saturn Awards again. After the box office success of The Weight of Water, Bigelow would again go back into the action world with 2002's troubled K-19 The Widowmaker, another box office flop and one of the most expensive independent movies ever made. The film tells the true story of the K-19 submarine and how the crew averted a nuclear meltdown that cost many of them their lives due to radiation exposure. The film wouldn't recoup its budget and would divide critics, meaning audiences stayed away. A review of the film from Empire sums up why it wasn't a suitable film for Bigelow. The cramped sets suffocate Bigelow's signature visual flourishes. While it's staggering that a movie based on a true story can be so cliche-ridden, don't submariners know that a picture of a girlfriend equals a death warrant, and unforgivably dull. It's also interminable, dragging on, and then dragging on some more. While it's admirable to see an American blockbuster side with the enemy, and there is one superb sequence involving an understandable act of cowardice, generally, K-19 is dead in the water. Following this big budget flop, Bigelow's next film would take another 5 years to materialize and would cost only $15 million. But it would be a film that would go on to garner Kathryn Bigelow's significant praise and an enviable awards haul for a war film that was at odds with the anti-war media view at the time and offered an exciting, positive view of the war, something audiences and critics responded to as an antidote to the general media coverage of a war going bad. The film is unusual in the fact that all it is a series of bomb disposals. Each act of bomb disposal in the Hurt Locker is replete with the potential to redeem the experience of the roadside bombs, military stalemate, and steadily growing casualty figures. The bombs James defuses, for example, prevent a UN building and its civilian workers from being destroyed, and he attempts to save an innocent Iraqi press-ganged into being a suicide bomber. But most dramatically, he risks his own life to prevent the desecration of a dead child's body. The underlying humanitarian impulse behind each of these acts ensures James is seen as a conventionally heroic, equal opportunity savior, and it's clear that not one of these sequences shows an IED in its most commonly used scenario, as a roadside bomb targeting US convoys. This episodic nature of the film was picked up in Peter Bradshaw's review for The Guardian. In some ways, Bigelow's film repudiates the conventions of narrative. It can be seen as simply a series of unbearably tense vignettes in which a soldier, his face dripping with fear and sweat, is hunched surgeon-like over a suspect device in the epicenter of an area that has been cleared in the shape of the coming blast. It's also worth noting as a huge departure from the tight spaces Bigelow was confined in for K-19, as here she uses huge 600-foot square plus sets and even larger open spaces, and gave the teams of cameramen free rein to cover the action that she then set loose, giving the film an almost handheld documentary feel to proceedings, without losing a cinematic edge. This space given by the cinematography was picked up in Roger Ebert's review at the time of the release, before the film had won any awards. The Hurt Locker is a great film, an intelligent film, a film shot clearly so that we know exactly who everybody is and where they are and what they're doing and why. The camera work is at the service of the story. Bigelow knows that he can't build suspense with shots lasting just 1 or 2 seconds, and he can't tell a story that way either. Not one that deals with the mystery of why a man like James seems to depend on risking his life, a leading contender for Academy Awards. Many directors would struggle with the expectation of their follow-up to such an award-winning film as The Hurt Locker, which would win Bigelow over 40 filmmaking awards and see her become the first female director to win an Oscar, and only the fourth to be nominated for Best Director after Lena Wertmuller, Seven Beauties in 1975, Jane Campion, The Piano in 1993, and Sofia Coppola, Lost in Translation, 2003. But after such an up-and-down career, it seemed Bigelow definitely had a point to prove, and her next two films would see her team up with her Hurt Locker writer Mark Boal to create two very powerful films in 2012's Zero Dark 30 and 2017's Detroit. In fact, ahead of the release of Zero Dark 30, the two were reported to be in a relationship, but The Hollywood Reporter was more excited about their professional collaboration. Zero Dark 30 director Kathryn Bigelow and writer-producer Mark Boal simultaneously seem to seek and repel Hollywood's embrace. They are widely admired for their talent and have created one of the most exciting film partnerships in recent memory. But with Boal more comfortable out front, they also have a reputation for antagonizing cast and crew and alienating important allies, none of which necessarily matters in Hollywood if they continue delivering the kinds of results that they do. Despite the criticism that Zero Dark 30 received over its perceived validation of the use of torture and the controversy around it having access to top-secret documents, the film was nominated for numerous awards, including Best Picture at the Oscars. Her follow-up, 2017's Detroit, won praise from critics but was not well received by cinemagoers, which is a real shame, as the film is a true tour de force. As well as being brilliantly directed, has some truly powerful performances. Mark Kermode praising the film in his 4-star review. Crucially, despite the efficiently evoked period setting, plaudits to production designer Jeremy Hindle, there's nothing distant about Detroit. As a broad canvas work that shifts from social realism to courtroom drama via crime thriller, musical fantasy, and social chiller, it confirms Bigelow as a dexterous master of her craft, as a wake-up call to a nation that is tense, tough, and terrifyingly timely. And it's this description of Bigelow as a master of her craft that we want to leave you with. Having seen all of Bigelow's films and some of her TV work, you can argue that she's always given her whole and creates a movie that is so well put together from a technical point of view that it's hard not to get swept up by her undeniable talent. But what is more impressive is Bigelow's dogged determination to keep going. Her films have been far from perfect, but when they are great, they are truly great. And her last 3 films in particular have been well worth spending time with. In fact, it's interesting that women filmmakers such as Greta Gerwig and Chloe Zhao have praised Bigelow and cited her as an inspiration. In fact, one of the most interesting things about Bigelow's directing career, when you hold up all the films she's directed, is actually how masculine they all are. Bigelow doesn't cater to gender or because of her gender, and this is how it should be. She makes films because that is who she is and what she does. They may be predominantly masculine in tone, subject, or voice, which says more about the Hollywood green light and studio system than anything. But honestly, who cares? Kathryn Bigelow is a talented, undeniably, award-winning, obviously, unique talent whose career has spanned 4 decades, regardless. To end this episode, it's only fitting that we let Kathryn Bigelow have the final say. There's really no difference between what I do and what a male filmmaker might do. I mean, we all try to give the best performance we can, we try to make our budget, and we try to make the best movie we possibly can. If there's specific resistance to women making movies, I just choose to ignore that as an obstacle for 2 reasons. I can't change my gender, and I refuse to stop making movies. It's irrelevant who or what directed a movie. The important thing is that you either respond to it or you don't. There should be more women directing. I think there's just not the awareness that it's really possible. It is, as we said, a trailblazer in its truest sense. What's your favorite Bigelow movie? Leave a comment below, and don't forget you can follow us on Twitter at the FilmFellas UK. Thanks for watching as always, and from me, CJ, and the team at FilmFellas, we hope you enjoyed this video, and if you have any suggestions for a future episode, then don't be afraid to let us know. Catch you next time.